After 25 years, swinging hammers under scorching suns, Tom Mitchell thought he knew everything about building. The ache in his back told him it was time to stop. When he returned to his childhood home in Cedar Falls, the old Victorian sat waiting like a patient memory. Paint peeled from weathered siding, and weeds claimed the front porch where his mother once served lemonade. What started as simple repairs became something else entirely. Behind a false wall in the basement, Tom discovered his father's hidden workshop. Blueprints covered every surface, detailing structures that defied explanation. Strange symbols marked corners of familiar town buildings. His father's journal spoke of the foundation beneath the foundation, and something called Project Cornerstone. The deeper Tom dug, the more questions surfaced. Why had his father been so secretive? What was he really building all those years? And why did the town's most powerful families seem so interested in Tom's renovations? But here's what haunted him most. What if his father's final project was never actually finished? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive into Cedar Falls felt like traveling backward through time. Tom's pickup truck groaned up the familiar hills, past the weathered sign that still proclaimed, "Welcome to Cedar Falls, population 2,847. The number hadn't changed since he was 12, though he suspected it had actually declined. Small towns had a way of bleeding their young people to bigger cities, leaving behind the stubborn and the settled. His childhood home sat at the end of Maple Street, a Victorian that had once been the pride of the neighborhood. Now it looked like an old man who'd forgotten to shave for a month. The wraparound porch sagged on one corner, and several shutters hung at dejected angles. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding in long, curling strips that reminded Tom of sunburned skin. He parked in the gravel driveway and sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. The last time he'd been here was for his father's funeral 3 years ago. Even then, he'd stayed only long enough for the service and the brief gathering afterward. The house had been too full of memories, too heavy with the weight of unfinished conversations. The front gate squeaked on rusty hinges as he pushed through the overgrown garden. His mother's rose bushes had gone wild, sending thorny tendrils across the stone walkway. The porch steps creaked under his weight, a familiar sound that brought back summer evenings, when his father would sit here after work. Still dusty from whatever construction site had claimed his day, Tom found the spare key where it had always been, under the loose board by the front door. His father had been a creature of habit, trusting in the small-town assumption that neighbors looked out for each other. The lock turned with some resistance, and the door swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty rooms. The smell hit him first, dust and closed spaces, with an underlying hint of his father's pipe tobacco that seemed to have soaked into the very walls. Sheets covered the furniture like ghosts of a former life. Afternoon sunlight slanted through grimy windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Tom Mitchell, is that really you? He turned to find Mrs. Patterson from next door, standing in the doorway, her grey hair pinned back in the same style she'd worn since he was 10. She held a casserole dish in her hands, because of course she did. Mrs. Patterson had been bringing casseroles to people for as long as he could remember. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson, it's good to see you." "Oh, you poor dear. We've all been wondering when you'd come back. The house has been so lonely, sitting here empty." She bustled past him, setting the dish on the sheet-covered dining room table. "I brought you some tuna noodle casserole. I remember it was always your favorite." Tom smiled despite himself. He'd actually hated tuna noodle casserole as a child, but Mrs. Patterson had been making it for him for so long that correcting her now seemed cruel. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful. Your father would be so pleased to know you're finally home. He worried about you, you know. All those years working construction, never settling down anywhere." She paused, studying his face with the frankness that only elderly neighbors could get away with. "You look tired, dear. It's been a long road back. Well, you're here now. That's what matters." She headed toward the door, then stopped. Oh, I almost forgot. Frank Morrison at the hardware store mentioned some folks have been asking about this place. Developers, I think. You might want to talk to him. After she left, Tom wandered through the house, reacquainting himself with rooms that seemed smaller than memory suggested. The kitchen still had his mother's cheerful yellow curtains, though they'd faded to the color of old butter. The living room held his father's recliner, positioned for the best view of both the television and the front yard. It was in his old bedroom that the memories hit hardest. His twin bed still sat against the wall, covered with the same blue plaid bedspread. Model airplanes hung from fishing line attached to the ceiling, gathering dust like suspended dreams. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph. Tom, at age 10, grinning gap-toothed between his parents at some long-forgotten family picnic. That night, Tom lay in his childhood bed and listened to the house settle around him. Every creak and groan was familiar, but somehow different. There were new sounds, too, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the basement. Though he was certain the water pipes had been turned off years ago, he'd planned to start the renovation work in the morning, beginning with the obvious problems: the sagging porch, the peeling paint, the broken shutters. Simple, straightforward repairs that would bring the old place back to life. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would change everything he thought he understood about his father, his family, and the very foundations upon which Cedar Falls had been built. Tom woke before dawn to the sound of rain drumming against the windows. The basement tapping had continued through the night, and now he could hear water dripping somewhere below. He pulled on work clothes and grabbed a flashlight from his toolbox, deciding to tackle the water problem before it got worse. The basement stairs creaked under his weight as he descended into the musty darkness. The smell of damp concrete and old wood filled his nostrils. His flashlight beam swept across familiar territory: his father's workbench along the far wall, shelves lined with paint cans and forgotten projects, the ancient furnace that had wheezed through countless winters. But something was wrong with the layout. Tom had spent countless hours in this basement as a child, helping his father with various projects, and the space felt different somehow. The back wall seemed closer than it should be, and when he paced off the dimensions, he realized the basement was a full 8 feet shorter than the house's footprint suggested. The water damage was worse than he'd expected. A dark stain spread across the back wall, where moisture had seeped through the foundation. As Tom examined the damage more closely, he noticed the drywall had pulled away from the studs in one corner. When he grabbed the loose edge and pulled, an entire section came away in his hands. Behind it was another wall. Tom stared at the rough wooden planks that had been hidden behind the drywall. They looked much older than the rest of the basement construction, weathered and darkened with age. A cool draft whispered through the gaps between the boards, carrying a musty smell that spoke of deeper, older spaces. He found a crowbar in his father's toolbox and began prying at the planks. The old wood splintered and gave way, revealing a doorway that had been carefully concealed. Beyond lay a room that shouldn't exist. Tom's flashlight illuminated a workshop that made his father's regular basement space look like amateur hour. Drafting tables lined the walls, their surfaces covered with blueprints held down by small weights. A professional architect's lamp cast strange shadows when he switched it on. Filing cabinets stood in precise rows, and a large corkboard covered one entire wall, but it was the blueprints that made his breath catch in his throat. Every major building in Cedar Falls was represented. The courthouse, the bank, the school, the library, even the old grain elevator on the edge of town. But these weren't standard architectural drawings. They showed details that no normal construction project would require. Basement layouts that extended far beyond building footprints, underground passages connecting structures, and notations in his father's careful handwriting that made no sense. Foundation extension, NW corridor complete, read one note beside the courthouse plans. Connection to vault secure. Maintain access, said another near the bank drawings. Strange symbols appeared throughout the blueprints. some kind of notation system that Tom didn't recognize. On the corkboard, a hand-drawn map of Cedar Falls showed the town from an entirely different perspective. Red lines connected the major buildings like veins in a body, following routes that seemed to run underground. Dates written beside various sections spanned decades, starting in the 1960s and continuing right up until a few months before his father's death. Tom picked up one of the blueprints, studying the familiar lines of the courthouse. He'd driven past that building thousands of times, but according to these plans, it had a basement level that extended far beyond its foundation, with corridors leading toward the bank and what appeared to be a chamber beneath the town square. A manila folder labeled Project Cornerstone sat prominently on the main drafting table. Inside, Tom found a collection of photographs showing construction work in various locations around town. His father appeared in several shots, always wearing the same serious expression, often standing beside men in suits who looked official and important. One photograph in particular caught his attention. It showed his father and several other men standing around what looked like a Native American artifact, some kind of stone carving or ceremonial object. The men were smiling, but his father's expression remained troubled. On the back, someone had written Original Cornerstone, 1847, relocated as planned. Tom spent the next hour examining every detail of his father's secret workshop. He found receipts for specialized construction equipment, correspondence with surveyors and archaeologists, and technical manuals for underground excavation. Everything pointed to the same impossible conclusion. His father had been involved in creating an extensive underground network beneath Cedar Falls. But why? And why had he kept it secret? As Tom prepared to leave the hidden workshop, he noticed one more thing. A loose floorboard near the back wall had been recently disturbed. When he pried it up, he found a leather-bound journal wrapped in oiled cloth. His father's name was embossed on the cover in faded gold letters. The first entry was dated 15 years ago. Written in his father's familiar handwriting, "They say it's necessary for the town's security, but I'm beginning to have doubts. What we're hiding down there was never meant to be disturbed." Tom carried the journal upstairs to the kitchen, where morning light streaming through the faded yellow curtains made reading easier. He poured himself coffee from the pot Mrs. Patterson had thoughtfully left with the casserole, and settled at the old oak table where his family had shared countless meals. The journal revealed a story that challenged everything Tom thought he knew about his father. Harold Mitchell hadn't just been a construction worker in Cedar Falls. He'd been part of something much larger and more secretive than Tom could have imagined. The early entries read like business notes. Meetings with town council members, discussions about foundation work and security improvements. His father wrote about the Prescott, Harrington and Blackwood families with the careful deference of a contractor dealing with powerful clients. But as Tom read deeper, the tone began to change. Met with Daniel Prescott again today. Read an entry from 12 years ago. He's pushing to expand the network into Sector 7, but I told him the survey work isn't complete. Truth is, I don't like what we found there. Some things should stay buried. Tom paused, remembering Daniel Prescott as a stern man who'd always seemed to appear at town functions surrounded by an air of importance. His construction company had handled every major building project in Cedar Falls for as long as Tom could remember. The journal entries became more detailed as his father's concerns grew. References to Project Cornerstone appeared with increasing frequency, along with mentions of federal surveys and archaeological assessments that had apparently been suppressed or ignored. The government inspector came by today, asking questions about the permits for the courthouse expansion his father had written 8 years ago. Margaret Blackwood handled it, but I could see the worry in her eyes. We're walking a dangerous line here. What started as protecting the town's heritage has become something else entirely. Tom found himself reading faster as the entries revealed the true scope of what his father had discovered. The underground network wasn't just a series of maintenance tunnels or storm drains. According to the journal, The passages connected chambers that contained historical artifacts and archaeological sites that predated the town's official founding by decades. Found another burial site today while extending the connection to the bank. Read an entry from 6 years ago. Complete pottery pieces, arrowheads, what looks like ceremonial items. Sarah Harrington says we should document everything properly, but Daniel insists we just move it all to the storage facility. I'm starting to think this isn't about preservation at all, the storage facility. Tom made a mental note to look for references to its location as he continued reading. His father's handwriting became more urgent in the later entries. Concerns about outside interest and federal oversight appeared regularly. There were mentions of arguments with the three families, particularly Daniel Prescott, who seemed to be pushing for expanded excavation despite his father's objections. Daniel brought in his own crew for the library expansion his father had written 3 years ago. Told me my services weren't needed for that phase. When I asked why, he said some work required special handling. I don't like the sound of that. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've never seen him look at me with such distrust. Tom felt a chill as he read the entries from his father's final months. The tone shifted from concern to something approaching fear. I think they're watching me, his father had written just 6 months before his death. Strange cars parked on the street, phone calls that hang up when I answer. Margaret tried to warn me to keep quiet, but I can't shake the feeling that what we've been doing is fundamentally wrong. These artifacts, these burial sites, they belong to someone. They deserve proper respect, not to be hidden away like stolen treasure. The journal's final entries revealed his father's growing determination to expose what he'd learned. He'd begun documenting everything, taking photographs, making copies of important papers. He'd even consulted with lawyers about whistleblower protections. I've made my decision, read the last entry, dated just 1 week before his fatal heart attack. Tom deserves to know the truth about what we've done here. If something happens to me, I've left everything he'll need to set things right. The workshop contains all the evidence. The safety deposit box at First National has the photographs and recordings. Most importantly, he needs to know about his grandmother's people. This land called him home for a reason. Tom's hands trembled as he set the journal down. His grandmother's people? What did that mean? His grandmother had died when he was very young, and his father had rarely spoken about her background. But one thing was crystal clear from the journal's final pages. His father hadn't died of natural causes while watching television, as Tom had been told. Harold Mitchell had been preparing to expose a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful families in Cedar Falls, and someone had silenced him before he could reveal the truth. The sound of a car door slamming outside interrupted his thoughts. Through the kitchen window, Tom saw a black sedan parked in his driveway and a man in an expensive suit walking toward his front door. Tom quickly closed the journal and slipped it into a kitchen drawer before answering the knock. The man on his porch was tall and impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of being the most important person in any room. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Daniel Prescott. I believe you know my family's construction company." His smile was polished, but didn't reach his eyes. "I wanted to welcome you back to Cedar Falls and see how you're settling in." Tom kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. This was one of the 3 men his father's journal had mentioned repeatedly, and not in flattering terms. "Mr. Prescott, what can I do for you?" "Well, I couldn't help but notice you've started some renovation work. The old place certainly needs attention." Prescott's gaze swept past Tom into the house. "I wanted to let you know that Prescott Construction would be happy to help with any major projects. We've been working on buildings in Cedar Falls for generations. We know the area's unique challenges." The way he said unique challenges made Tom's skin crawl. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm planning to handle most of the work myself." Of course. "A man likes to work with his own hands." Prescott stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But some projects require special permits, special knowledge of local codes. The basement work, for instance." I understand there was some water damage. Tom felt a chill. How could Prescott possibly know about the basement already? Just minor issues. Nothing I can't handle, I'm sure. But if you discover anything unusual during your renovations, I hope you'll give me a call. Sometimes old houses hold surprises that are better left undisturbed. Prescott handed Tom an expensive business card. For the good of the community, you understand. After Prescott left, Tom drove straight to the Cedar Falls Public Library. If his father's journal was accurate, the three families had controlled the town for decades, and their influence would be documented somewhere in the public records. The library was housed in a stately brick building that, according to his father's blueprints, sat atop one of the underground chambers. Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, remembered Tom from his childhood and was eager to help with his genealogy research. Your father was quite interested in local history toward the end, she said, pulling out boxes of historical documents. He spent many hours here, particularly researching the town's founding families. Tom spread the documents across a reading table, looking for connections between the Prescotts, Harringtons, and Blackwoods. What he found was a pattern of control that stretched back to Cedar Falls' founding in 1847. The original town charter showed that Jeremiah Prescott, Aldrich Harrington, and Silas Blackwood had purchased the land from the federal government after it was surveyed and cleared for settlement. But the more Tom read, the more questions arose about what had been cleared. Government correspondence from the 1840s mentioned negotiations with local Native American tribes, but the details were vague. Several letters referenced archaeological concerns and preservation agreements, but the specifics had been carefully omitted from the public records. Most interesting was a map from 1850 that showed the original town layout. Several important buildings had been positioned in specific locations that corresponded exactly to the underground network his father had documented. It was as if the entire town had been planned around whatever lay beneath the ground. Tom found newspaper clippings from the 1960s documenting major renovation projects on all the key buildings. The courthouse had been modernized in 1965, the bank expanded in 1967, and the library restored in 1969. In every case, Prescott Construction had handled the work, and in every case, the projects had involved extensive basement modifications. Finding everything you need? Mrs. Henderson asked, checking on his progress. Actually, I'm curious about something. Do you have any records of archaeological surveys done in the area, particularly from the 1960s or 1970s? Her expression grew cautious. Well, there were some federal surveys done when they were planning the highway extension, but those records aren't available to the public. You'd need special permission from the town council. Who's on the town council? Mayor Sarah Harrington, Deputy Mayor Margaret Blackwood, and Council Chairman Daniel Prescott, she replied automatically, then seemed to realize the significance. Oh my, you're asking about the three founding families, aren't you? That evening, Tom stopped by Morrison's Hardware to pick up supplies for the basement repairs. Frank Morrison had run the store for 40 years and knew everyone in town. Tom Mitchell. Heard you were back. Frank was a bear of a man with calloused hands and an honest face. Your father was a good customer. Always bought quality materials, never cut corners. Frank, can I ask you something? In the months before my father died, did he seem worried about anything? Frank's expression grew serious. He glanced around the empty store, then leaned across the counter. Your father was a careful man, Tom, methodical, but toward the end he started asking strange questions. Wanted to know about foundation materials that could be removed without damaging structural integrity. Asked about concrete analysis, soil testing equipment, things that didn't make sense for normal construction work. Did he say why? Not directly, but he did mention something about wanting to undo some mistakes before it was too late. Frank paused, studying Tom's face. Why are you asking? Did you find something in the house? Tom was about to answer when he noticed Frank's attention shift to the window. A car had pulled up outside, the same black sedan Daniel Prescott had been driving. Maybe we should continue this conversation another time, Frank said quietly. Some folks in this town don't like it when people ask too many questions about the past. Tom drove home with his mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was more disturbing than he'd imagined. His father hadn't just stumbled onto some local corruption. He'd discovered a conspiracy that reached back to the town's founding and involved systematic cover-up of what appeared to be significant archaeological sites. That night, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Twice, he thought he saw headlights turn off quickly when he looked out the window. Around midnight, he heard the soft sound of footsteps on gravel outside the house. He moved carefully to the front window and peered through a gap in the curtains. 3 figures in dark clothing were moving systematically around his property, using small flashlights to examine the foundation and peer into windows. One of them spent several minutes studying the basement window wells, as if looking for signs of recent excavation. Tom grabbed his father's journal and the most important blueprints from the hidden workshop, stuffing them into a waterproof bag that he hid in the old root cellar behind the house. If someone was planning to search the place, they wouldn't find the most damaging evidence. The next morning revealed that his caution had been justified. When Tom went down to the basement, he found subtle signs that someone had been in his father's secret workshop. Nothing was missing, but papers had been moved and carefully replaced. Dust patterns on the filing cabinets showed that drawers had been opened and closed. Most telling of all, the loose floorboard where he'd found the journal had been pried up and hastily repositioned. Someone had been looking for exactly what Tom had already found and hidden. That afternoon, Tom drove to an electronics store in the next town over and purchased a small security camera system. He spent the evening installing hidden cameras in the basement workshop, the main basement area, and near the entrances to the house. If his watchers returned, he'd have evidence of who they were and what they were after. He didn't have to wait long. The first night's footage showed nothing, but the second night revealed exactly what Tom had suspected. 3 individuals entered through the basement window around 2 a.m., moving with the confidence of people who had done this before. They wore dark clothing and kept their faces hidden, but their behavior was methodical and professional. What shocked Tom was how familiar they seemed with the house's layout. They moved directly to the hidden workshop without any hesitation, suggesting they knew exactly where to look. One figure spent considerable time photographing the remaining blueprints, while another examined the filing cabinets with what appeared to be professional lock-picking tools. Most disturbing was the third figure, who seemed to be in charge. This person directed the others with hand signals and spent time examining Tom's recent footprints and disturbances in the dust. When this figure finally looked directly at one of Tom's hidden cameras, Tom got a clear view of the face. It was Daniel Prescott. The footage from subsequent nights showed a pattern of surveillance that chilled Tom to the bone. The watchers returned every few nights, always when Tom was asleep, always conducting the same systematic search. They were looking for something specific, and Tom began to suspect it was his father's journal and the evidence it contained. On Thursday morning, Tom made a decision that would change everything. He contacted the local FBI field office and requested a meeting. If his father had been murdered for threatening to expose archaeological crimes, then this was a federal matter that required federal intervention. But first, he needed to secure the evidence his father had died protecting. Tom spent that afternoon carefully documenting everything in the hidden workshop. He photographed every blueprint, every notation, every piece of correspondence. He made detailed notes about the underground network his father had helped construct, and the archaeological sites that had apparently been looted and hidden. Most importantly, he found his father's safety deposit box key, hidden in a hollowed-out book on the workshop's single bookshelf. The book was titled Preserving America's Heritage, and Tom couldn't help but appreciate his father's sense of irony. That evening, Tom called Frank Morrison at home. "Frank, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Do you think my father's death was really from natural causes? The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Tom wondered if the connection had been lost. "Tom," Frank finally said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like guilt. "Your father came to see me 3 days before he died. He was scared, really scared. Said he'd learned something that was going to tear this town apart, but that he couldn't live with keeping quiet anymore. He asked me to look after you if anything happened to him. Why didn't you tell me this at the funeral?" "Because I was a coward. Because I've lived in this town my whole life, and I know what happens to people who cross the wrong families. But seeing you back here, asking the same questions your father asked, I can't stay quiet anymore." Frank paused, and Tom could hear him moving around, as if checking to make sure he wasn't being overheard. "Tom, whatever you're planning to do, you need to be very careful. These people have been protecting their secrets for over a century, and they've proven they'll do whatever it takes to keep them buried." The next morning, Tom made his way to the basement with his father's hand-drawn tunnel map and a powerful flashlight. If the underground network really existed, he needed to see it for himself before involving federal authorities. Physical evidence would make his story credible rather than the ravings of a grieving son with an overactive imagination. The workshop's back wall showed signs of his father's modifications over the years. What had initially appeared to be solid foundation stone actually concealed a carefully constructed entrance. Tom found the hidden mechanism his father had described in his journal, a loose stone that, when turned clockwise, released a counterweight system that swung a section of the wall inward. The passage beyond was unlike anything Tom had expected. Instead of a rough tunnel carved through earth, he found himself in a carefully constructed corridor with brick walls and a vaulted ceiling. Electric lighting ran along the walls, powered by cables that disappeared into junction boxes marked with recent dates. This wasn't some abandoned 19th century construction. It was a modern, actively maintained facility. Tom followed the passage as it curved eastward toward the center of town. The air was cool and dry, with the faint hum of ventilation systems that spoke of sophisticated environmental controls. Every 50 feet, metal plates in the floor marked distances and directions in his father's precise handwriting. The first major chamber opened up after about 200 yards of walking. Tom's flashlight beam revealed a space the size of a large room, with shelves lining the walls from floor to ceiling. But these weren't storage shelves for construction materials or town records. They held artifacts that made Tom's breath catch in his throat. Pottery vessels sat carefully arranged on padded shelves, their surfaces decorated with intricate patterns that spoke of great age and careful craftsmanship. Stone tools and weapons were displayed in glass cases with handwritten labels indicating where they'd been found. Most striking of all were the ceremonial items, ornate headdresses, beaded clothing, and what appeared to be sacred objects that belonged in a museum, not hidden in an underground chamber. Tom photographed everything, his camera flash illuminating details that made the scope of the collection clear. This wasn't just a few random artifacts discovered during construction projects. This was a systematic collection that represented decades of organized looting from archaeological sites. The chamber's walls told an even more disturbing story. Maps showed the locations where various items had been discovered, with dates ranging from the 1960s through the previous year. Many of the sites corresponded to major construction projects that Tom remembered from his childhood. The new school, the shopping center, even the expanded water treatment plant. Each time construction had required excavation in certain areas of Cedar Falls, the crews had apparently encountered Native American artifacts and burial sites. Instead of reporting these discoveries to proper authorities, the three families had systematically looted the sites and hidden the evidence in this underground facility. Tom continued deeper into the tunnel system, following the main passage as it branched toward different parts of town. A side tunnel led toward the courthouse, another toward the bank. The engineering was impressive. Whoever had designed this network had created a system that allowed discrete movement between all the major buildings in Cedar Falls. It was in the largest chamber, directly beneath what Tom calculated to be the town square, that he made the most significant discovery. The room was dominated by a raised platform that held what could only be described as a shrine. Ancient stone carvings formed a circle around a central altar, and the walls were covered with pictographs that depicted ceremonies and rituals. This wasn't just another collection site. This was an intact Native American ceremonial chamber that had been buried when the town was built over it. The builders of Cedar Falls hadn't just found scattered artifacts. They'd built their community directly on top of a sacred site and then spent the next century systematically looting it. Tom found a folder of documents. On a modern table beside the shrine, the papers included correspondence with private collectors, appraisal reports for various artifacts, and sales records showing that items from the collection had been sold to museums and collectors around the world over the decades. The profits had been substantial. Conservative estimates suggested the three families had made millions of dollars from the illegal sale of Native American artifacts, all while maintaining the appearance of respected community leaders. But it was the final document in the folder that made Tom's hands shake as he read it. A geological survey from 1995 had confirmed what the families had apparently suspected for years. The ceremonial chamber sat at the center of one of the most significant undiscovered Native American archaeological sites in the region. The federal government had planned to declare the entire area a protected site, which would have ended all development in Cedar Falls and exposed the family's decades of illegal activity. The survey had been suppressed through bribes and political influence, but copies of the report had survived. Tom's father had found one of those copies, and it had cost him his life. As Tom prepared to leave the chamber with his photographic evidence, he heard sounds that made his blood run cold. Footsteps echoed from the tunnel entrance, and voices carried through the underground passages. Someone else was in the tunnels, and they were heading directly toward his location. Tom quickly switched off his flashlight and moved to the shadows behind the ceremonial altar. The ancient stone carvings provided some concealment, but he knew that if someone entered the chamber with lights, he'd be discovered immediately. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sound of at least two people moving through the tunnels with the confidence of familiarity. Tom could make out fragments of conversation as the voices approached. Should have sealed that entrance years ago. Father was getting too close to the truth. Can't afford to have him following the same path. Tom's heart raced as he recognized Daniel Prescott's voice among the speakers. They were talking about his father, and it sounded very much like they were admitting to murder. The beam of a powerful flashlight swept across the chamber entrance, followed by Prescott and another man Tom didn't recognize. The stranger was younger, dressed in expensive outdoor clothing, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "This is the main chamber," Prescott was saying, gesturing toward the ceremonial platform. "The geological survey estimated it's been here for at least 400 years. The artifacts we've recovered from this site alone are worth millions. And you're certain the federal investigation was contained?" the stranger asked. "Completely. The survey team met with an unfortunate accident, and all copies of their report were destroyed. Or so we thought, until Harold Mitchell started asking questions." Tom's blood ran cold. His father hadn't just discovered evidence of archaeological looting. He'd found proof that federal investigators had been murdered to cover up the crimes. "What about the son?" the stranger continued. "He's been poking around the house, asking questions in town. Tom Mitchell is a problem, but a manageable one. He's isolated, no family, no real connections to the community. If he has an accident during his renovation work, no one will ask too many questions." Tom fought the urge to run. These men were casually discussing his murder as if it were a routine business decision. But he needed to hear more, needed to understand the full scope of what he was facing. Prescott moved toward the document table, apparently unaware that Tom had already photographed everything. The Harrington girl has been asking uncomfortable questions lately. Sarah's always been the weak link in our arrangement. Too much conscience, not enough practical sense. Can she be managed? One way or another. Margaret Blackwood has been loyal for 50 years, but she's getting old. When she's gone, Sarah will be the only Harrington left, and young women can be persuaded to see reason. The threat in Prescott's voice was unmistakable. Tom realized that Sarah Harrington might be in as much danger as he was, simply for having moral qualms about her family's involvement in the conspiracy. "Show me the storage areas," the stranger said. "I want to see the inventory before we finalize the overseas sales." As the two men moved toward a side passage that Tom hadn't yet explored, he saw his chance to escape. Moving as quietly as possible, he slipped from his hiding place and made his way back toward the tunnel entrance. But his foot caught the edge of a loose stone, sending it skittering across the chamber floor. The sound echoed in the enclosed space like a gunshot. What was that? The stranger's voice was sharp with alarm. Tom ran. Behind him, he could hear Prescott shouting orders and the sound of pursuit. The tunnel that had seemed well lit and inviting on his way in now felt like a trap closing around him. His flashlight beam bounced wildly as he sprinted toward the hidden entrance to his father's workshop. He reached the concealed door just as flashlight beams appeared in the tunnel behind him. Tom squeezed through the opening and quickly reset the counterweight mechanism, sealing the passage just as his pursuers rounded the final curve. Tom could hear them on the other side of the false wall, their voices muffled but urgent. They knew he'd been in the tunnels, knew he'd seen things that could destroy them. But they also knew where he lived, where he went, who he talked to. The next morning brought a formal letter delivered by certified mail. The return address showed the law offices of Prescott. Harrington and Associates. Apparently the three families didn't just control the town's construction and politics, they also controlled its legal system. The letter was politely worded, but unmistakably threatening. It cited various building code violations that required immediate attention, questioned the legitimacy of Tom's renovation permits, and suggested that continued work on the property might result in criminal charges for disturbing sensitive historical sites. Most ominously, it concluded with a generous offer to purchase the property as is for significantly more than its assessed value, with the understanding that Tom would relocate permanently outside of Cedar Falls. Tom read the letter twice, then picked up his phone to call Frank Morrison. If the three families thought they could intimidate him into silence the way they had apparently silenced his father, they were about to learn that Harold Mitchell had raised his son to be more stubborn than smart. But when Frank answered the phone, his voice was strained and worried. "Tom, I'm glad you called. We need to talk, but not over the phone. Can you meet me at the old grain elevator after dark? And Tom, be very careful. Sarah Harrington stopped by the store this morning looking for you. She seemed scared." Before meeting Frank that evening, Tom decided to visit First National Bank to access his father's safety deposit box. The key he'd found in the hollowed-out book felt heavy in his pocket as he walked through the bank's marble lobby, past portraits of Cedar Falls founding families that now seemed more like mugshots than honored ancestors. The bank manager, Mr. Griswold, was a nervous man in his 60s who had clearly been expecting Tom's visit. His hands shook slightly as he verified Tom's identification and led him to the vault area. "Your father was very particular about this box," Griswold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Very particular about who could access it and under what circumstances. He left specific instructions that it should only be opened in the event of his death, and only by you." The safety deposit box was larger than Tom had expected, and when Griswold unlocked it and left him alone in the small viewing room, Tom understood why his father had needed the extra space. Inside were multiple USB drives, each labeled with dates and locations around Cedar Falls. Tom plugged the first one into his laptop and found himself looking at hundreds of photographs documenting the underground tunnel system from angles he hadn't seen during his own exploration. But these weren't just casual snapshots. His father had methodically documented every chamber, every stolen artifact, every piece of evidence that proved the three families' crimes. The photographs were professionally composed and dated, creating an irrefutable record of systematic archaeological looting spanning decades. The second USB drive contained audio recordings that made Tom's hands tremble as he listened. His father had apparently worn a wire during meetings with Daniel Prescott, Margaret Blackwood, and other conspirators. The conversations revealed the full scope of their operation in chilling detail. "The federal team is getting too close," Prescott's voice said on one recording dated just months before his father's death. "They've identified the burial sites, and they're asking questions about our construction permits. We need to accelerate the removal process. What about the ceremonial chamber?" That was Margaret Blackwood's voice, older and more refined than Prescott's, but equally cold when discussing the destruction of sacred sites. "We'll have to relocate the most valuable pieces," his father's voice responded, and Tom realized with a shock that Harold Mitchell had been an active participant in these discussions, not just an observer. "But I'm concerned about the stability of the main tunnel if we remove the central altar." "The tunnel's stability is less important than our financial stability," Prescott replied sharply. "That altar is worth more than everything else combined. Our buyer in Switzerland is prepared to pay 8 figures for an intact ceremonial stone circle." Tom paused the recording, struggling to process what he'd heard. His father hadn't just discovered the conspiracy, he'd been part of it. The moral outrage in his journal entries now took on a different meaning. Harold Mitchell had been a man trying to find redemption for his own crimes. The third USB drive contained the most damaging evidence yet. Digital copies of bank records showing payments from overseas collectors, shipping manifests for cultural artifacts sent to private buyers around the world, and correspondence with auction houses that specialized in discreet sales of archaeological items. The financial records painted a picture of breathtaking greed. Over the past 30 years, the three families had made over $50 million from the sale of stolen Native American artifacts. The money had been laundered through various construction projects and real estate investments, all carefully designed to appear legitimate while hiding the true source of their wealth. But it was the fourth USB drive that contained the evidence Tom needed to understand his father's final months. A geological survey report marked "Confidential Federal Investigation Team" revealed that the ceremonial chamber beneath Cedar Falls was part of a much larger archaeological complex that qualified for protection. Under federal law, the report recommended immediate cessation of all development in the area and the involvement of tribal representatives in preserving the site. It also included a detailed assessment of artifacts that had already been removed, with estimates of their cultural and financial value that dwarfed even Tom's worst assumptions. The final item in the safety deposit box was a handwritten letter addressed to Tom. His father's familiar script covered several pages, and reading it felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave. "Son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've discovered what I spent the last 20 years of my life trying to hide from. I know you must be disgusted with what I've done, and you have every right to be. What started as honest construction work became something I'm deeply ashamed of. I want you to know that I tried to stop it. When I realized what we were really doing, when I understood that we were destroying sacred sites and stealing the heritage of people who had already lost so much, I couldn't be part of it anymore. But they wouldn't let me walk away. The evidence in this box represents my attempt to make things right. The photographs, recordings, and documents prove everything that's been done and who's responsible. But more importantly, they can help return what's been stolen to its rightful place. There's something else you need to know, something I should have told you years ago. Your grandmother, my mother, was Native American. Her people were the original inhabitants of this land, and you have a legal right to advocate for the protection of these sites. I've been a coward for too long, Tom. I hope you'll be braver than your old man. The ceremonial chamber contains items that belong to your ancestors. Returning them might not undo the damage we've caused, but it would be a start. Be careful. These people killed to protect their secrets before, and they'll do it again. But you're the only one left who can set things right. Tom sat in the small bank room for a long time after finishing the letter, trying to process everything he'd learned. His father hadn't been the innocent victim Tom had imagined, but he'd died trying to make amends for his mistakes. Now it was Tom's turn to decide what price he was willing to pay for justice. That evening, Tom drove to the abandoned grain elevator on the outskirts of town. The massive concrete structure loomed against the darkening sky like a monument to Cedar Falls' agricultural past. Frank's truck was already parked in the shadows, but Tom noticed a second vehicle, a small sedan that he didn't recognize. Frank emerged from the darkness as Tom approached, his face grim in the fading light. "Tom, I'm glad you came. There's someone here who needs to talk to you. Someone who's been waiting a long time to tell the truth." A young woman stepped out from behind the grain elevator's base. Even in the dim light, Tom could see the family resemblance that marked her as a Harrington, the same aristocratic bone structure and intelligent eyes that appeared in the historical photographs at the library. "Sarah Harrington," she said, extending her hand. "I've been hoping you'd come back to Cedar Falls ever since your father died." Sarah was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she spent more time in courtrooms than country clubs. There was a wariness in her manner that spoke of someone who'd learned to be careful about whom she trusted. "Frank told me you've been asking questions about the three families," she continued. "I think it's time you learned the truth about what we've been hiding." Tom studied her face, remembering Prescott's threats against her from the conversation he'd overheard in the tunnels. "How do I know you're not part of whatever they're planning?" "Because I've been fighting them for years," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a conviction that rang true. "My grandfather involved our family in this conspiracy, but I never agreed to it. When I inherited my share of the family's interests, I started looking for a way out." She reached into her jacket and pulled out an object wrapped in soft cloth. When she unwrapped it, Tom found himself looking at an ornate ceremonial knife with an intricately carved handle and a blade that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. "This belonged to the original inhabitants of this land," Sarah said. "My family has been guarding it for 3 generations, along with the guilt of how we came to possess it. It's supposed to be returned to its proper resting place in the ceremonial chamber, but only by someone with the right bloodline." Tom reached out to touch the knife and felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, as if the artifact was somehow familiar, despite the fact that he'd never seen it before. "Your father figured out that you have that bloodline," Sarah continued. "That's why they killed him. Not just because he was going to expose the theft and the cover-up, but because he was planning to reveal your heritage and your legal right to reclaim the sacred sites." Frank stepped closer, his voice heavy with years of suppressed guilt. "Tom, I should have told you this at your father's funeral, but I was scared. 3 days before he died, your father came to me with a copy of his mother's birth certificate. She was registered with the local tribal council, which makes you eligible to represent your ancestors' interests. The families have been terrified of this possibility for decades," Sarah added. "Someone with legitimate tribal standing could challenge their ownership of the land, demand the return of stolen artifacts, and expose the murder of federal investigators who were getting too close to the truth." Tom felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Help me return what's been stolen," Sarah said. "I've been documenting everything for years, gathering evidence, trying to build a case that could stand up in federal court. But I needed someone with legal standing to actually file the claims. She handed Tom a thick folder. This contains proof of everything. The looting, the murders, the financial records, even the location of artifacts that have been sold to private collectors. With your father's evidence and your tribal heritage, we can not only expose the conspiracy, but actually get justice for your ancestors. Why should I trust you? Tom asked. You're part of one of the three families. Because I'm risking my life by being here, Sarah replied. Prescott and the others think I'm a manageable problem, but if they knew I was working with you, I'd end up like your father. The only reason I'm still alive is that they think they can control me through family loyalty and intimidation. Frank nodded grimly. She's been feeding me information for 2 years. Tom, everything I knew about your father's investigation came from Sarah. She's been trying to find someone brave enough to stand up to them. Tom looked at the ceremonial knife in his hands, feeling the weight of generations of injustice and the possibility of finally setting things right. What's the first step? We need to get into the ceremonial chamber and document everything properly, Sarah said, with federal investigators and tribal representatives present. The families can't cover up what they've done if there are official witnesses, and if they try to stop us. Sarah's expression grew hard. Then we make sure the whole world knows what Cedar Falls was built on. Sometimes the only way to heal old wounds is to expose them to the light. As they prepared to leave the grain elevator, Tom noticed headlights approaching in the distance. Sarah saw them too, and her face went pale. We need to go, now. They've been watching me, and if they see us together... The three of them quickly separated, agreeing to meet again in 2 days to finalize their plans. As Tom drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The next morning brought the first signs that the families knew about his meeting with Sarah. Tom was awakened by the sound of heavy vehicles in his driveway. Through the bedroom window, he saw 2 county building inspection trucks and a Cedar Falls police cruiser parked outside his house. The lead inspector was a thin man with a clipboard and the self-important demeanor of someone who enjoyed wielding petty authority. Mr. Mitchell, we're here to conduct a safety inspection of your renovation work. We've received reports of unpermitted electrical and structural modifications. Tom knew the inspection was harassment, but he had no choice but to comply. The inspector spent 3 hours examining every aspect of his work, photographing minor imperfections and documenting code violations that would have been overlooked in any normal inspection. You'll need to cease all work immediately, the lead inspector announced as they prepared to leave. These violations require professional remediation before you can continue. We estimate it'll take 6 to 8 weeks to process the necessary permits. After they left, Tom found an official notice posted on his front door, declaring the property unsafe for habitation, pending code compliance. The timing was no coincidence. They were trying to force him out of the house while they dealt with whatever threat he represented. That afternoon brought another visitor. Tom answered a knock at the door to find a woman in an expensive business suit holding a briefcase and wearing the predatory smile of a high-powered attorney. Mr. Mitchell, I'm Patricia Westin from the law firm of Blackwood, Prescott and Associates. I represent the Cedar Falls Historical Preservation Society, and we have some concerns about your renovation activities. She handed him a folder thick with legal documents. Our archaeological consultants have determined that your property may contain sensitive historical artifacts. Continued excavation could constitute destruction of irreplaceable cultural resources, which carry significant criminal penalties under federal law. Tom scanned the papers, recognizing the legal maneuvering for what it was, a preemptive strike designed to criminalize any further investigation of his father's discoveries. However, the attorney continued, my clients are prepared to resolve this matter amicably. The Historical Preservation Society is prepared to purchase your property for fair market value, plus a substantial premium for any inconvenience. The offer is time-sensitive, 48 hours to accept. That evening, Tom called Sarah from a payphone outside town, not trusting his home phone or cell service. "They're turning up the pressure," he told her. "Building inspectors, legal threats, forced evacuation. They're trying to push me out before I can expose what they've done." "I know." Sarah's voice was tense. "They called an emergency family meeting this morning. Margaret Blackwood wants to resolve the Mitchell situation permanently. Prescott is pushing for a more direct approach." "What kind of direct approach?" "The kind that leaves no loose ends. Tom, I think you need to accelerate your timeline. If we're going to expose this, it has to be soon." Tom had already been thinking the same thing. "I need to get my father's medical records. If they poisoned him, there should be evidence in the autopsy report. I can help with that. I still have some contacts at the county coroner's office from my law practice. But Tom, if we find proof that your father was murdered, we're not just dealing with archaeological crimes anymore. We're talking about people who killed to protect their secrets." The next day, Sarah met Tom at a diner in the next county. Far from the watchful eyes of Cedar Falls, she carried a manila envelope that she handled like it contained explosives. "I got the records," she said, sliding the envelope across the table. "But you're not going to like what they show." Tom opened the envelope and found his father's complete medical file, including toxicology reports that had never been shared with the family. The official cause of death was listed as myocardial infarction, heart attack, but the toxicology screen told a different story. "Digitalis poisoning," Tom read aloud. "Levels consistent with ingestion of concentrated foxglove extract. Digitalis mimics the symptoms of a heart attack," Sarah explained. "In an elderly person with a history of cardiac issues, it would be almost impossible to detect without specific testing. The coroner never looked for it because there was no reason to suspect foul play." Tom studied the report, feeling a cold fury building in his chest. "This proves they murdered him. It proves he was poisoned. But proving who did it will be much harder. Digitalis can be extracted from common garden plants. It's virtually untraceable if you know what you're doing." "What about the other federal investigators your father mentioned? Are there records of their deaths?" Sarah nodded grimly. 3 federal archaeologists died in a car accident in 1995, just weeks after completing their survey of Cedar Falls. Single-vehicle crash on a mountain road, no witnesses. The investigating officer was Daniel Prescott's brother-in-law. Tom felt the pieces of the conspiracy falling into place like a jigsaw puzzle of murder and corruption. "How many people have they killed to protect this secret?" "I don't know. But I'm afraid we're about to find out." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. Her face went pale as she read it. "What is it?" "Margaret Blackwood wants to see me tonight. Emergency family meeting. She says it's about finalizing our arrangement with Mr. Mitchell." Sarah looked up at Tom, fear clear in her eyes. "I think they're planning to make their move." "Don't go. If they suspect you're working with me, I have to go. If I don't show up, they'll know something's wrong. But Tom, whatever happens tonight, you need to be ready to contact federal authorities immediately. I have a feeling our time just ran out." That night, Tom sat in his darkened living room with his father's evidence spread across the coffee table and his phone ready to call the FBI field office at the first sign of trouble. The building inspection notice had forced him to shut off the electricity, but the shadows suited his mood as he waited for word from Sarah. Around midnight, headlights swept across his front windows. Tom moved to peer through the curtains, expecting to see either Sarah returning or worse, Prescott's men coming to eliminate the last witness to their crimes. Instead, he saw an elderly woman walking slowly up his front path, using a carved wooden cane for support. She moved with the careful dignity of someone who had once commanded respect and still expected it, despite her advanced age. Tom opened the door before she could knock. "Mrs. Blackwood." Margaret Blackwood was in her 80s, with silver hair styled in an elegant wave, and clothes that spoke of old money and older traditions. But her eyes held a weariness that seemed to have settled bone deep over many years. "Mr. Mitchell, I apologize for the late hour. But I'm afraid this couldn't wait. Her voice carried the refined accent of someone educated in elite schools decades ago. May I come in? We have much to discuss and very little time. Tom stepped aside to let her enter, keeping his phone within easy reach. Where's Sarah? She was supposed to meet with your family tonight. Sarah is safe for now. I sent her home with instructions to pack a bag and leave town immediately. What I'm about to tell you will put us both in considerable danger, and I couldn't bear to see another young person suffer for the sins of their elders. Margaret settled into his father's old recliner with a sigh that seemed to carry decades of accumulated regret. I've come to give you what you need to finish what your father started. The complete truth about what we've done and why it must end. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick folder bound with ribbon. This contains the original archaeological survey from 1995, the one that was supposed to be destroyed. It proves that this entire area should have been declared a protected site decades ago. Tom opened the folder and found himself looking at detailed maps and photographs of archaeological sites throughout Cedar Falls. The survey documented not just isolated artifact discoveries, but an extensive Native American settlement that had existed here for centuries before European colonization. The site beneath your house is particularly significant, Margaret continued. It was a ceremonial center for multiple tribes, a place where important spiritual and political gatherings took place. The artifacts we've been collecting represent 400 years of continuous indigenous presence. Why are you telling me this? You've been part of the conspiracy for 50 years. Margaret's laugh was bitter. Longer than that, actually. I was 28 when my father brought me into the family business. He told me we were preserving important historical artifacts that would otherwise be lost to careless development. It took me years to understand that we were actually destroying the cultural heritage of an entire people. She gestured toward the survey report. When the federal team arrived in 1995, I thought it was our chance to do the right thing. Finally, experts who could properly preserve and study what we'd found. But Daniel Prescott saw only the end of a profitable enterprise. So you helped him murder the investigators? I didn't know what he was planning until it was too late. By the time I realized the car accident wasn't an accident, I was already implicated in covering up the evidence. Prescott made sure I understood that confession would mean prison for all of us. Including my granddaughter Sarah. Margaret stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness as if expecting to see watchers in the shadows. For 28 years, I've lived with the guilt of those deaths. But when your father started asking questions, started gathering evidence, I thought perhaps there was finally a way to make amends. My father came to you. Harold approached me 6 months before his death. He'd discovered most of the truth on his own, but he needed confirmation about the federal investigation. I was weak, Mr. Mitchell. I was terrified of what Prescott would do if he knew I was talking, so I tried to discourage your father from pursuing his investigation. Tom felt pieces clicking into place. But you didn't report him to Prescott. No, instead I began gathering my own evidence. Insurance, you might call it. Proof of everything we'd done, including Prescott's role in the murders. I hoped that if your father was successful in exposing us, I could at least ensure that the right people were held accountable. She returned to her handbag and produced a small digital recorder. This contains recordings of conversations with Daniel Prescott over the past 3 years. Admissions of murder, details about the artifact sales, even discussions about eliminating potential witnesses, including my father, including your father, and now, I'm afraid, including you and Sarah. Margaret's voice grew heavy with exhaustion. Daniel called another meeting for tomorrow night. He's convinced the family lawyers that you represent an existential threat to our operations. They're planning to stage another accident. Tom took the recorder, understanding the magnitude of what the elderly woman was risking. Why now? After all these years, why are you finally doing the right thing? Because I'm dying, Mr. Mitchell. Cancer. I have perhaps 3 months left, and I refuse to take these secrets to my grave. More importantly, because I've spent 28 years watching what guilt and fear do to a person's soul. I won't let Sarah inherit that burden. Margaret stood to leave, moving slowly toward the door. The recordings, the survey report, and your father's evidence should be sufficient to bring federal charges. But you must act quickly. Daniel is planning to eliminate all loose ends within the next 48 hours. What about you? If Prescott realizes you've betrayed the conspiracy, I'm an 83-year-old woman with terminal cancer, Mr. Mitchell. What more can he take from me? Margaret smiled sadly. Besides, I have one final card to play, something that will ensure Daniel Prescott never threatens anyone again. As she reached the door, Margaret turned back to face Tom one last time. Your father was a good man who made a terrible mistake, but you have the chance to honor both your father's memory and your ancestors' legacy. Don't let fear stop you from doing what's right. After she left, Tom sat in the darkness, holding the recorder and the survey report, feeling the weight of justice finally within his grasp. Tom spent the rest of the night organizing all the evidence he'd gathered. His father's photographs and recordings, Margaret's archaeological survey, the toxicology report proving murder, and the digital recorder containing Prescott's confessions. Spread across his kitchen table, the documents told a complete story of conspiracy, murder, and cultural destruction spanning over 50 years. At dawn, Tom called the FBI field office in the state capital. Agent Rebecca Chen answered his call with the professional skepticism of someone who'd heard countless conspiracy theories from paranoid citizens. Mr. Mitchell, you're claiming that prominent citizens in your town have been systematically looting Native American burial sites and murdering federal investigators to cover it up. I have photographs, audio recordings, financial records, and toxicology reports proving everything I've told you, Tom replied. And I have reason to believe they're planning to kill more people within the next 48 hours to silence witnesses. Agent Chen's tone shifted. Mr. Mitchell, if what you're alleging is true, this would constitute violations of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, multiple homicides, and conspiracy charges. These are extremely serious accusations. I understand that. I also understand that my father was murdered for gathering this evidence, and I'll be next if we don't act quickly. Can you bring the evidence to our office today? Not safely. The people involved control the local police and have been watching my movements. I need federal protection before I can leave Cedar Falls. Agent Chen was quiet for a moment. Mr. Mitchell, are you claiming to have Native American heritage that would give you standing to file NAGPRA complaints? Yes, I have documentation proving my grandmother was registered with the local tribal council. I also have the artifacts that need to be returned to their proper resting place. I'm going to connect you with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and our Archaeological Crimes Unit. This is going to require a coordinated federal response. That afternoon, Tom received a call from Agent Maria Santos of the BIA. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years fighting for Native American rights and didn't suffer fools gladly. Mr. Mitchell, Agent Chen briefed me on your situation. I've been investigating illegal artifact trafficking for 15 years, and what you're describing matches patterns we've seen in other cases. Can you verify your tribal heritage? Tom faxed copies of his grandmother's registration documents and birth certificate to the BIA office. Within hours, Agent Santos called back with confirmation that Tom had legitimate standing to represent his ancestors' interests in recovering stolen artifacts. Mr. Mitchell, based on your grandmother's lineage, you're entitled to file formal complaints under NAGPRA and to participate in any repatriation proceedings. But more importantly for our investigation, you have legal authority to authorize federal access to the archaeological sites. What does that mean? It means we can conduct an official investigation of the ceremonial chamber and tunnel system without needing local permits or cooperation. If your evidence is accurate, we're looking at one of the largest archaeological crime cases in U.S. history. That evening, Tom met Frank at the grain elevator to share what he'd learned. Frank brought disturbing news of his own. "Tom, I've been watching the hardware store all day, and I've seen things that worry me. Prescott's people have been buying supplies, tarps, lime, shovels, the kind of things you'd need to dispose of evidence or bodies. Margaret Blackwood warned me they're planning to eliminate witnesses. It's worse than that. I overheard a conversation between two of Prescott's men. They're planning to destroy the entire tunnel system, collapse it with explosives, and claim it was a natural sinkhole. That would eliminate all the physical evidence and anyone who might be inside at the time." Tom felt his blood run cold. "When? Tomorrow night? They're telling everyone it's a controlled demolition to address structural instability beneath the town center. The evacuation order goes out in the morning. We have to stop them. If they destroy the ceremonial chamber, we'll lose proof of everything." Frank nodded grimly. "I've been thinking about that. There's only one way to preserve the evidence and expose what they've done. What's that? We get federal agents and tribal representatives into the tunnels before Prescott can destroy them. Force a confrontation that's too public for them to cover up." Tom pulled out his phone to call Agent Santos. "How quickly can you get a team to Cedar Falls? Given the urgency and the potential for destruction of evidence, we could have agents there by tomorrow afternoon. But Mr. Mitchell, if these people are planning to use explosives, we're talking about an extremely dangerous situation. More dangerous than letting them destroy 400 years of cultural heritage and get away with multiple murders." "Point taken. We'll coordinate with local tribal representatives and the Archaeological Crimes Unit. But I need you to promise me something. Don't attempt to enter those tunnels until we arrive. If they're planning to collapse the system, you could be walking into a death trap." After ending the call, Tom and Frank sat in the growing darkness, both understanding that the next 24 hours would determine whether justice was finally served or whether the conspiracy would succeed in burying its secrets forever. "Tom," Frank said quietly, "are you ready for this? Once we involve federal authorities and tribal representatives, there's no going back. This whole town is going to change forever." Tom thought about his father's journal, about Margaret Blackwood's guilt-ridden confession, about the ceremonial knife that Sarah had entrusted to him. Most of all, he thought about the ancestors, whose sacred sites had been violated and whose cultural heritage had been stolen for profit. "Some changes are long overdue," he replied. "My father spent 20 years trying to find the courage to do the right thing. I'm not going to wait that long." The next morning brought chaos to Cedar Falls. Emergency vehicles lined the streets around the town center, and workers in hard hats were setting up barriers and evacuation notices. The official story was structural instability caused by underground water damage, requiring controlled demolition to prevent catastrophic collapse. Tom watched the preparations from his kitchen window, knowing that Prescott was orchestrating the destruction of evidence on a massive scale. Every hour that passed brought them closer to losing the proof they needed to expose decades of crimes. His phone rang at 10 a.m. Margaret Blackwood's voice was strained and urgent. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to see you immediately. There's something crucial I didn't tell you last night. Something that changes everything about your heritage and your legal rights. The federal agents are arriving this afternoon." "Can't this wait?" "No, it cannot. Meet me at the library in 30 minutes. Come alone and bring the ceremonial knife that Sarah gave you." Tom drove to the library through streets that looked like a disaster zone. Workers were installing seismic monitoring equipment and posting signs warning residents to stay away from the town center. The urgency was clearly manufactured, but the threat was real. Prescott intended to bury the truth along with the evidence. Margaret was waiting in the library's local history section, surrounded by boxes of documents that Tom had never seen before. She looked even more frail than she had the night before, but her eyes burned with the intensity of someone racing against time. "Sit down." "Mr. Mitchell, What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to process, but it's essential that you understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. She pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it to reveal documents that were clearly much older than anything Tom had seen so far. The paper was yellowed and brittle, and the handwriting was in the formal script of the 19th century. These are the original deeds and agreements from when Cedar Falls was founded in 1847, the documents that were hidden from public view to conceal the true nature of how the land was acquired. Tom studied the papers, struggling to make sense of the archaic legal language. What do they say? They reveal that the land wasn't purchased from the federal government, as the official records claim. It was acquired through a private treaty with the local tribal leaders, a treaty that was supposed to protect the sacred sites in perpetuity. Margaret pointed to a specific clause in the agreement. The tribal leaders agreed to allow limited settlement on the condition that the ceremonial grounds would remain undisturbed, and that specific artifacts would be protected by appointed guardians until such time as they could be properly returned. Guardians. The three founding families weren't conquerors, Mr. Mitchell. They were trustees, appointed by the tribal council to protect the sacred sites until the displaced people could return to reclaim them. Tom felt the ground shifting beneath his understanding of everything he'd believed about Cedar Falls history. But they've been looting the sites for decades. Yes, somewhere along the way, the families forgot their true purpose and began to see the artifacts as valuable commodities rather than sacred trust. What started as protection became exploitation. Margaret reached into another box and pulled out a document that made Tom's breath catch in his throat. It was a birth certificate yellowed with age, bearing his grandmother's name, but this wasn't the same birth certificate Tom had seen before. Your grandmother wasn't just registered with the tribal council, Mr. Mitchell. She was the daughter of the last traditional chief, the keeper of the sacred sites. According to tribal law and the original treaty, that makes you more than just a descendant with standing to file complaints. Tom stared at the document, trying to process what he was seeing. What does it make me? The rightful heir to the guardianship, the person with ultimate authority over the ceremonial sites and the artifacts they contain. Margaret pulled out one final document, a map that showed not just the tunnel system Tom had discovered, but an extensive network that connected sacred sites throughout the entire region. Cedar Falls wasn't just built over one ceremonial area, but over the spiritual heart of a vast Native American cultural complex. The artifacts we've been hiding aren't just valuable relics, Mr. Mitchell. They're the sacred objects necessary for tribal ceremonies that haven't been performed for over a century because the items were thought to be lost forever. Tom looked at the ceremonial knife he'd brought, understanding for the first time why it had felt familiar when Sarah gave it to him. This is more than just a knife. It's the ceremonial blade used by tribal leaders to consecrate sacred ground and perform repatriation rituals. Without it, your ancestors' spirits cannot be properly honored or put to rest. Margaret's voice grew urgent as the sound of heavy machinery rumbled outside. Mr. Mitchell, the treaty grants you the legal authority to reclaim all the sacred sites and artifacts, but only if you can perform the proper ceremonies before sunset today. What ceremonies? The knife must be returned to its place in the central altar of the ceremonial chamber, but it can only be placed there by someone of direct chiefly lineage during the traditional time of spiritual balance, the hours between noon and sunset on the day the sites are threatened. Tom felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. Today, if Prescott destroys the chamber tonight, the opportunity will be lost forever. The artifacts will lose their spiritual connection to the sacred ground, and your legal claim under the original treaty will become void. The library's front door chimed as someone entered. Margaret's face went pale as she looked past Tom toward the entrance. We have a problem. Tom turned to see Daniel Prescott walking purposefully toward their table. flanked by two men in expensive suits who had the bearing of either lawyers or hired muscle. Margaret, I'm disappointed. After all these years of loyalty to the family arrangement, you choose now to develop a conscience. Prescott's tone was conversational, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made Tom's skin crawl. Mr. Mitchell, I believe you have something that belongs to our organization. Tom kept his hand on the ceremonial knife, hidden beneath the papers on the table. Everything here belongs to the people your families stole it from. Ah, but that's where you're wrong. You see, Margaret hasn't told you the whole truth about your precious heritage. Prescott pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. Your grandmother may have been of tribal blood, but she forfeited any claim to guardianship when she married your grandfather and left the reservation. According to tribal law, marriage outside the tribe breaks the bloodline succession. Margaret shook her head firmly. That's not true, Daniel. The tribal council never revoked her status, because the tribal council was never informed of the marriage. But we have documentation proving that your grandmother's union invalidated her ceremonial standing. Any claims based on her lineage are legally meaningless. Tom felt his heart sink as Prescott's words hit home. If his grandmother had lost her tribal standing, then his entire legal position crumbled. But Margaret smiled grimly and pulled out one more document from her boxes. Actually, Daniel, you're wrong about one crucial detail. Tom's grandmother never married his grandfather in a legally binding ceremony. They lived together and had children, but no marriage certificate was ever filed. She handed Tom the document. This is a tribal council resolution from 1952, confirming that your grandmother retained her full ceremonial status and bloodline rights until her death. As her eldest male descendant, those rights passed to you automatically. Prescott's confident expression faltered. That's impossible. We would have known about such a resolution, not if it was deliberately hidden from your families to protect future generations. You see, Daniel, the tribal elders suspected that the guardianship families might eventually betray their trust. They made provisions to ensure that the true guardianship could be reclaimed when the time was right. Tom looked at the resolution in his hands, feeling the full weight of his heritage for the first time. He wasn't just someone with Native American ancestry trying to right historical wrongs. He was the designated protector of sacred sites with legal authority that predated any claims by the founding families. The federal agents are already en route, Tom said quietly. And now I have the legal standing to authorize their investigation of every site you violated. Prescott stood slowly, his face flushed with anger and what might have been fear. Mr. Mitchell, you're making a grave mistake. This town has been peaceful for over a century because everyone understood their place in the arrangement. Disrupting that balance will have consequences you can't imagine. The only thing I can't imagine is how you've gotten away with murder and cultural destruction for so long. As Prescott and his men left the library, Margaret gathered up the documents with hands that shook from more than just age. Tom, you now have everything you need to reclaim your ancestors' heritage and expose the family's crimes. But you must act quickly. The ceremony must be completed before they destroy the chamber. And Prescott will do everything in his power to stop you. Tom looked at the ceremonial knife, understanding that his journey back to Cedar Falls had never been about simple home renovation. It had been about coming home in the truest sense, returning to fulfill a destiny that had been waiting for him his entire life. The federal agents arrived in Cedar Falls at 2 o'clock that afternoon, creating an immediate stir in the small town. Agent Rebecca Chen led a team from the FBI's Archaeological Crimes Unit, while Agent Maria Santos brought representatives from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and 2 tribal elders who had driven down from the reservation when they learned about the sacred sites. Tom met them at the police station, which Prescott hadn't yet managed to evacuate despite his emergency demolition plans. The presence of federal agents had clearly disrupted the conspiracy's timeline, and Tom could see Prescott's people scrambling to adjust their strategy Mr. Mitchell, Agent Chen said, after reviewing the evidence Tom had brought, this is one of the most comprehensive cases of archaeological crime we've encountered. The scope of the looting operation and the evidence of murder to cover it up makes this a priority investigation. Agent Santos introduced Tom to the tribal elders. Joseph Wyndham, a man in his 70s with silver braids and eyes that seemed to look right through to Tom's soul. And his daughter, Dr. Elena Wyndham, a professor of anthropology who specialized in repatriation cases. Son, Joseph said, gripping Tom's hand with surprising strength, we've been waiting a long time for someone to come forward with the authority to reclaim our stolen heritage. Your grandmother was my cousin, and she often spoke of her children and grandchildren who had been scattered by circumstance. Dr. Wyndham examined the ceremonial knife with reverent care. This is the Keeper's Blade, one of the most sacred artifacts of our people. It was used for centuries to consecrate ceremonial grounds and perform the rituals that maintain spiritual balance between the living and the ancestors. Margaret Blackwood said, I need to return it to the ceremonial chamber before sunset, Tom explained. But Prescott is planning to destroy the tunnel system tonight. The timing is significant, Joseph said. Today marks the autumn equinox, a time of spiritual balance when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. If the blade can be returned to its proper place during the sacred hours, the spiritual connection to the land can be restored. Agent Chen was clearly struggling with the metaphysical aspects of the case. Mr. Mitchell, from a law enforcement perspective, we need to secure the tunnel system as evidence before anyone attempts to destroy it. The ceremonial aspects will have to wait until we can guarantee everyone's safety. But if we wait, the opportunity will be lost, Dr. Wyndham explained. The blade must be returned during the equinox, or its spiritual power will be broken. These aren't just artifacts we're talking about. They're the sacred objects necessary for healing generations of spiritual wounds. Tom felt the weight of competing responsibilities. His duty as a citizen was to cooperate with federal authorities and ensure that evidence was preserved for prosecution. But his duty as the hereditary guardian was to restore the spiritual balance that had been disrupted for over a century. How long do we have before Prescott's demolition? He asked Agent Chen. According to the permits we've reviewed, the controlled demolition is scheduled for 8 p.m., but we've obtained a federal court order suspending all activity pending our investigation. Prescott won't honor a court order if he thinks the evidence will destroy him, Tom replied. He's already murdered federal investigators to protect this secret. Frank Morrison appeared at the police station, looking haggard and worried. Tom, I've been watching Prescott's crew all day. They're not setting up for a controlled demolition. They're planting enough explosives to level half the downtown area. Agent Santos exchanged a concerned look with her colleagues. That level of destruction suggests they're planning to eliminate all evidence, regardless of collateral damage, and anyone who might be in the tunnels at the time, Tom added grimly. Joseph Wyndham spoke up with quiet authority. Agent Chen, Agent Santos, I understand your concerns about safety and evidence preservation. But from our perspective, the spiritual harm caused by destroying those sacred sites would be irreparable. Some things are more important than criminal prosecutions. With respect, Mr. Wyndham, we can't authorize civilian access to an area that's been rigged with explosives. Tom made his decision. Then I'll go alone. As the hereditary guardian, I have the legal authority to access those sites. The original treaty grants me rights that supersede local law enforcement authority. Tom, that's suicide, Frank protested. If Prescott realizes you're in the tunnels when he triggers the explosives, then we make sure he can't trigger them, Dr. Wyndham said. The federal court order gives you grounds to arrest anyone who attempts to interfere with the investigation. Agent Chen shook her head. We don't have enough personnel to secure all the potential access points. If Prescott has been planning this demolition for weeks, his people could trigger the explosives from multiple locations. What if we could get Sarah Harrington to help? Tom suggested. She knows Prescott's plans, and she has access to the family's operational details. Where is Miss Harrington now? Agent Santos asked. Margaret told her to leave town, but I don't think she would abandon her responsibility to see this through. Let me try to contact her. Tom called Sarah's cell phone, which went straight to voicemail. But when he tried the landline at the Harrington family estate, she answered on the first ring. Tom, thank God. I've been hiding in the estate's basement since last night. Prescott's people have been watching the house, but I think they assume I left town, as Margaret instructed. Sarah, the federal agents are here, and we have the evidence we need to expose everything. But we need to get into the ceremonial chamber before Prescott destroys it. Can you help us disable the demolition charges? I don't know anything about explosives, but I know where Prescott is coordinating the operation from. He set up a command center in the courthouse basement, using the tunnel system to access the blast sites. Agent Chen had been listening to the conversation on speakerphone. Ms. Harrington, this is Agent Chen with the FBI. If you can provide us with the location of the command center, we can interrupt their operation. It's more complicated than that, Sarah replied. The command center is connected to the main ceremonial chamber. If you move against Prescott there, he could trigger the charges immediately rather than risk exposure. Tom realized they were facing an impossible situation. Any direct action against Prescott would likely result in the destruction of the very evidence they were trying to preserve. But allowing him to proceed with his demolition plan would achieve the same result. There might be another way, Dr. Wyndham said thoughtfully. If Tom can reach the ceremonial chamber and perform the return ritual, the spiritual protection might be enough to prevent the destruction. You're talking about magic, Agent Chen said skeptically. I'm talking about the power of doing the right thing at the right time in the right way, Joseph Wyndham replied. Your people have tried to solve this problem through force and law for decades. Perhaps it's time to try honoring the original agreements and restoring the balance that was meant to be maintained. Tom looked around the room at the faces of people who had become his allies in this fight for justice. Federal agents who believed in upholding the law, tribal elders who understood the deeper spiritual dimensions of the conflict, friends who were willing to risk their safety to expose the truth, and a woman from one of the founding families who had chosen conscience over loyalty. I'm going into those tunnels, he decided, with or without official authorization. My ancestors have been waiting over a century for someone to restore what was stolen from them. I won't let them wait any longer. Then we're going with you, Frank said firmly. You'll need backup if Prescott tries to stop you. And we'll coordinate with federal agents to secure the command center simultaneously, Agent Santos added. If we can time it correctly, we might be able to prevent the demolition while ensuring the ceremony can be completed. Joseph Wyndham stepped forward and placed his hands on Tom's shoulders. Son, what you're about to do requires more than courage. It requires faith in the connection between past and present, between the living and those who have gone before. Your grandmother's spirit will guide you, but you must trust in the power of doing what's right. Dr. Wyndham handed Tom a small leather pouch. These are traditional offerings: tobacco, sage, sweet grass. When you place the blade in its proper location, offer these to the spirits of your ancestors and ask for their blessing on the healing that must begin. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Tom prepared for what might be his final journey into the tunnels beneath Cedar Falls. The ceremonial knife felt warm in his hands, as if it were eager to return home after more than a century of exile. Outside, the sound of heavy machinery continued as Prescott's demolition crew made their final preparations. But inside the police station, Tom was surrounded by people who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. The time for planning was over. The time for action had arrived, At 5:30 p.m., with the autumn sun casting long shadows across Cedar Falls, Tom made his way to the hidden entrance in his father's workshop. The federal agents had positioned themselves around the courthouse, ready to move against Prescott's command center at Tom's signal. Frank and Sarah waited at strategic positions to provide backup and early warning of any threats. Tom carried the ceremonial knife in one hand and his father's flashlight in the other. The leather pouch of traditional offerings hung from his belt, and he wore his father's old work clothes. Somehow it seemed appropriate that Harold Mitchell's son should complete this mission dressed as a construction worker, honoring the honest labor that had originally brought their family into contact with these sacred sites. The tunnels felt different this time. Where before they had seemed like evidence of conspiracy and crime, now they felt like pathways leading home. Tom moved through the passages with growing confidence, following the route to the central ceremonial chamber where his ancestors had gathered for countless generations, before European colonization disrupted their spiritual practices. As he approached the main chamber, Tom heard voices echoing from ahead. His heart sank as he realized that Prescott had anticipated his move and stationed guards at the ceremonial site. Tom switched off his flashlight and moved forward carefully in the darkness, using his father's knowledge of the tunnel system to approach the chamber from an unexpected angle. Through a narrow side passage that his father's blueprints had marked as an emergency exit, Tom could observe the main chamber without being detected. What he saw made his blood run cold. Daniel Prescott stood beside the ancient altar, directing two men who were placing explosive charges around the ceremonial platform. The sacred stone carvings that had survived for centuries were being rigged for destruction, and the artifacts that remained in the chamber would be obliterated along with any evidence of the family's crimes. "Make sure the charges are sufficient to collapse the entire chamber," Prescott was saying. "When this is over, there won't be enough left for any archaeological investigation." One of the men looked up from his work. "What about the federal agents?" "They've got the courthouse surrounded. Let them surround it. By the time they realize what's happening, this site will be buried under tons of rubble, and any inconvenient witnesses will be buried with it." Tom realized that Prescott wasn't just planning to destroy evidence. He was planning to eliminate anyone who threatened his conspiracy. The explosives were intended to kill Tom, Sarah, and possibly the federal agents who had come to investigate. Moving as quietly as possible, Tom activated the emergency communicator Agent Chen had given him. "This is Tom. Prescott is in the ceremonial chamber with explosive charges. He's planning to trigger them regardless of who might be inside. You need to move on the command center now." Agent Chen's voice crackled back through the small device. "Copy that. We're moving in 30 seconds. Get out of there, Tom." "Negative. I'm completing the ceremony. My ancestors have waited long enough." Tom switched off the communicator and moved toward the chamber entrance. He had perhaps 5 minutes before the federal raid would alert Prescott to change his timeline. The ceremony had to be completed before then, or the spiritual connection would be lost forever. As Tom stepped into the chamber, Prescott spun around with an expression of fury and something that might have been fear. "Mr. Mitchell, I should have known you'd be foolish enough to come here." "This is where I belong," Tom replied, walking steadily toward the altar despite the explosive charges surrounding it. "This is where my ancestors gathered, where my grandmother should have been able to practice her spiritual traditions, where the sacred objects were meant to remain. Your ancestors were savages who didn't understand the value of what they possessed. We've preserved these artifacts, protected them, even found buyers who appreciate their historical significance. You've stolen them, sold them, murdered people to cover up your crimes." Tom continued moving toward the altar, the ceremonial knife warm in his hand. "But that ends today," Prescott gestured to his men, who moved to block Tom's path. "I'm afraid it ends with you, Mr. Mitchell. Another tragic accident during unauthorized exploration of unstable underground areas. The federal agents know I'm here. If anything happens to me, you'll face murder charges. If anything happens to you, the federal agents will assume you were killed in the collapse they're about to witness. Sometimes old tunnel systems simply can't withstand the stress of modern development. Tom heard the sound of distant gunfire and shouting from the direction of the courthouse. The federal raid had begun, which meant Prescott would accelerate his timeline rather than risk capture. "Kill him," Prescott ordered his men. "Then trigger the charges immediately." As the two men moved toward Tom, the chamber suddenly filled with additional voices. Sarah Harrington emerged from the main tunnel entrance, followed by Frank Morrison and 3 federal agents. Behind them came Joseph and Dr. Elena Wyndham, carrying traditional items for the ceremony. "Daniel, it's over," Sarah announced. "The federal agents have your command center, and they've arrested your demolition crew. There's nowhere left to run." Prescott's face twisted with rage. "Sarah, you've destroyed everything our family's built. Everything we've worked for over 3 generations. We built it on lies and murder and the destruction of sacred sites. Some things deserve to be destroyed." Joseph Wyndham stepped forward, his presence commanding despite his age. "Mr. Prescott, you and your families were entrusted with protecting these sacred places until they could be properly restored to our people. Instead, you chose profit over honor, theft over trusteeship. Your people lost this land fair and square." "We don't owe you anything. The original treaty says otherwise," Dr. Wyndham replied, producing a copy of the documents Margaret had shared with Tom. "Your families agreed to serve as guardians, not owners. That agreement has never been dissolved." Tom realized that while everyone was focused on the confrontation with Prescott, this was his opportunity to complete the ceremony. He moved toward the altar, where the ancient stone carvings formed a circle around a central depression that was clearly meant to hold the ceremonial knife. As Tom approached the sacred platform, he felt a profound sense of connection to the generations of his ancestors who had stood in this same place. The knife in his hand seemed to pulse with spiritual energy, eager to return to its proper home after more than a century of exile. "Stop!" Prescott shouted, realizing what Tom was attempting. "If you place that knife, you'll establish legal claim to this entire area. Our families will lose everything. Your families lost their moral claim decades ago when they chose greed over guardianship," Tom replied. He stepped onto the ceremonial platform and felt the ancient stones warm beneath his feet. The carvings seemed to glow in the light of the federal agents' flashlights, and the air in the chamber grew thick with spiritual presence. Tom knelt before the central altar and placed the ceremonial knife in the depression that had been carved specifically to hold it. The blade settled into place with a soft clicking sound, as if a lock had finally been opened after centuries of waiting. From the leather pouch, Tom removed the traditional offerings Joseph had provided. As he sprinkled tobacco, sage, and sweet grass around the altar, he spoke the words that Dr. Wyndham had taught him during their brief time together. "Ancestors, we return what was taken from you. We restore what was broken. We honor what was forgotten. May this sacred place once again serve its proper purpose as a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the spirits." As Tom completed the offering ritual, something extraordinary happened in the chamber. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and a wind began to blow through the tunnels, despite the fact that they were deep underground. The federal agents' flashlights flickered, and for a moment the chamber was filled with a soft, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the ceremonial knife itself. Prescott stared in shock as his 2 men dropped their weapons and backed away from the altar. Even his hardened mercenaries seemed to recognize that they were witnessing something beyond their understanding or control. "It's done," Joseph Wyndham said with deep satisfaction. "The spiritual balance has been restored. The sacred sites are once again under proper protection." Agent Chen moved to arrest Prescott, but he seemed to have aged years in the past few minutes. The fight had gone out of him completely, replaced by the hollow look of a man who had just watched his life's work crumble around him. "Mr. Prescott," Agent Chen said as she placed him in handcuffs, You're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, violations of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and destruction of federal evidence. As the federal agents led Prescott and his men out of the chamber, Tom remained kneeling beside the altar. The ceremonial knife rested in its proper place for the first time in over a century, and the spirits of his ancestors finally had the acknowledgement and respect they deserved. Sarah approached Tom and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished." Tom looked up at her, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced since returning to Cedar Falls. He spent his life trying to make amends for the mistakes he'd made. "I think he'd be happy to know that the circle is finally complete." Dr. Wyndham began documenting the artifacts that remained in the chamber, preparing for their proper preservation and study. But more importantly, she was ensuring that future generations would understand the spiritual significance of what had been restored. The sacred sites beneath Cedar Falls were home again, protected by their rightful guardian and honored by people who understood their true value. The conspiracy that had hidden them for over a century was finally exposed, and justice would be served for all those who had died protecting these sacred places. As Tom finally stood and prepared to leave the chamber, he felt his father's presence one last time, not as a burden of unfinished business, but as a blessing on the work that had finally been completed. 6 months later, Tom stood on the front porch of his fully renovated Victorian home, watching as workers installed the final piece of a memorial garden that had been designed in collaboration with the tribal council. The house that had brought him back to Cedar Falls now served a purpose his father never could have imagined. It had become a cultural center, bridging the gap between the town's official history and its true heritage. The renovation had taken on a completely different meaning once Tom understood his role as guardian of the sacred sites. Working with tribal artists and historians, he had incorporated traditional Native American design elements throughout the house while preserving its Victorian character. The result was a building that honored both the indigenous heritage of the land and the more recent history of the families who had called it home. The basement workshop, where Tom had first discovered his father's secrets, now served as a research center where archaeologists and tribal historians worked together to catalogue and study the artifacts that had been recovered from the underground chambers. The hidden entrance to the tunnel system remained, but it was now properly secured and used only for official archaeological work conducted with full tribal oversight. Sarah Harrington had become Tom's partner in both the cultural center's operations and in life. Her decision to testify against her own family's conspiracy had cost her dearly. She'd been disowned by most of the Harrington relatives and had lost access to the family fortune, but she'd gained something more valuable in the process. She'd found peace with herself and a sense of purpose that no amount of inherited wealth could have provided. The Harrington Foundation, established with the remaining family assets after restitution payments, now funded educational programs about Native American history and supported archaeological preservation efforts throughout the region. Sarah's legal expertise had proven invaluable in navigating the complex process of returning stolen artifacts to their proper tribal homes. Margaret Blackwood had lived just long enough to see Daniel Prescott convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to life in prison. Her testimony had been crucial in exposing the full scope of the conspiracy, and her final months had been spent working with federal investigators to track down artifacts that had been sold to private collectors around the world. She died peacefully in her sleep, having finally unburdened herself of decades of guilt. Frank Morrison had been appointed as the town's official liaison to the tribal council, using his knowledge of Cedar Falls history and his reputation for honesty to help rebuild relationships that had been damaged by generations of deception. The hardware store had become an unofficial information center where residents could learn about the town's true heritage and the ongoing archaeological discoveries. The underground ceremonial chamber had been properly preserved and was now accessible to tribal members for traditional ceremonies that hadn't been performed in over a century. Tom participated in these gatherings as the hereditary guardian, learning ancient traditions from elders who had kept the spiritual knowledge alive despite the theft of their sacred objects. The federal investigation had expanded beyond Cedar Falls, revealing similar conspiracies in other small towns throughout the region. Tom's courage in exposing the truth had inspired other descendants of displaced tribal members to investigate their own communities' hidden histories. Most importantly, the sacred sites beneath Cedar Falls were once again serving their intended purpose as places of spiritual connection and cultural continuity. The ancestors whose graves had been violated were finally at rest, and their descendants could practice their traditions in the places where those traditions had originated. 1 year after returning home, Tom stood before the new courthouse cornerstone at its dedication ceremony. The massive stone bore inscriptions in both English and the local tribal language, symbolizing Cedar Falls' commitment to acknowledging its complete history rather than the sanitized version that had been promoted for over a century. The ceremony drew representatives from multiple tribes, federal officials who had worked on the archaeological crimes investigation, and residents of Cedar Falls who were still learning to reconcile their town's true past with the myths they'd been taught. Tom's role as both hereditary guardian and community leader had made him a bridge between worlds that had been artificially separated for too long. Sarah stood beside him, wearing traditional beadwork that had been gifted to her by tribal elders, who appreciated her courage in exposing her own family's crimes. She'd become more than just Tom's partner. She'd become a passionate advocate for indigenous rights and cultural preservation, using her legal skills to help other communities reclaim their stolen heritage. The new cornerstone bore a simple but powerful message. In honor of all peoples who have called this land home, and in commitment to truth, justice, and healing, it replaced the original stone that had been carved with symbols representing the secret conspiracy of the founding families. Joseph Wyndham offered a blessing in his native language, asking the spirits to protect the sacred sites and guide the community toward a future built on honesty rather than deception. His words carried across the gathered crowd, with the weight of centuries of suppressed truth finally being acknowledged. Tom reflected on how his journey from burned-out construction worker to cultural guardian had been guided by forces he was only beginning to understand. The restlessness that had driven him away from Cedar Falls in his youth had actually been a call to return. When he was ready to fulfill his ancestral responsibilities, his father's workshop remained exactly as Harold Mitchell had left it, preserved as a memorial to a man who had spent the final years of his life trying to make amends for earlier mistakes. The journal entries and hidden evidence had become part of the historical record, ensuring that future generations would understand both the scope of the conspiracy and the courage required to expose it. The Victorian house that had brought Tom home now hosted regular gatherings where difficult conversations about history and healing could happen in a safe space. School groups visited to learn about archaeological preservation, and tribal elders shared traditional stories that connected the past to the present. Tom's construction expertise continued serving the community, but now his projects focused on building structures that honored sacred sites rather than destroying them. Each foundation he laid, each building he renovated, was done with an awareness of the cultural layers beneath the surface. As the dedication ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Tom returned to the workshop where his father had spent so many late nights wrestling with his conscience. He understood now that Harold Mitchell's greatest construction project hadn't been any building. It had been laying the groundwork for his son's eventual Return to complete the mission that had cost him his life. The cycle was complete. Where lies had once provided the foundation for power and wealth, truth now offered the bedrock for genuine healing and community. Tom's story had inspired others to examine their own family histories and community secrets, proving that courage could be contagious when someone was brave enough to take the first step. The foundation beneath the foundation had finally been exposed, and on that solid ground of truth, something better could be built. Tom quickly switched off his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall beside the chamber entrance. The voices grew closer, and he could make out at least 2 people moving through the tunnels with the confidence of those familiar with the layout. The motion sensors picked up activity around midnight, one voice said. Tom recognized it as Daniel Prescott. He's been down here for over an hour. Are you certain it's him? The second voice was older, female, with the refined accent of someone educated and wealthy. Who else would it be? The Mitchell boy has been asking questions all over town. Frank Morrison called to warn me that Tom's been inquiring about his father's final days. Tom felt a surge of anger. Frank had seemed trustworthy, but apparently even he was part of the network that had killed Tom's father. The footsteps stopped just outside the ceremonial chamber. Tom held his breath, pressing deeper into the shadows beside a display case filled with ancient pottery. He's seen too much, the woman's voice continued. The photographs, the documents, the artifacts. We can't let him leave here with that information. Margaret's right, Prescott replied. We've protected this secret for over a century. I won't let some outsider destroy what our family's built. Margaret. That had to be Margaret Blackwood, the 3rd member of the conspiracy. Tom now understood that all 3 founding families were actively involved in maintaining the cover-up. Light from their flashlights began to sweep the chamber. Tom realized he had only moments before they discovered him. But as he prepared to make a run for one of the side tunnels, he heard something that stopped him cold. Sarah's been asking questions too, Margaret said. My granddaughter thinks we should come clean about everything. She doesn't understand what exposure would cost us. Sarah Harrington is young and idealistic, Prescott replied dismissively. She'll learn to appreciate the family business eventually, or she'll be dealt with like Harold Mitchell was. The casual way Prescott mentioned his father's murder sent rage coursing through Tom's veins. These people had killed his father and were now threatening to kill their own family members to protect their secret. The heart attack was clean, Margaret said. No one suspected anything, but we can't use the same method twice. Too suspicious. We won't need to, Prescott said. Tom Mitchell is going to have an unfortunate accident down here. Cave-ins happen in old tunnels. Very tragic, but these historical sites can be dangerous. Tom realized they were planning to kill him right here in the underground chamber and make it look like an accident. But he also understood something else. Sarah Harrington was apparently not part of the conspiracy. She might be an ally if he could reach her. Moving as quietly as possible, Tom began working his way toward a side tunnel that led in the direction of the library. He'd studied his father's maps carefully and knew there were multiple exit points throughout the tunnel system, but as he moved, his foot knocked against a loose stone. The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. There! Prescott's voice was sharp with authority. He's in the north corridor. Margaret, block the main tunnel. Don't let him reach the exit. Tom abandoned stealth and ran. His flashlight beam bounced wildly as he sprinted through the narrow passage, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind him. These tunnels were their territory, but Tom's construction background had taught him to read architectural layouts quickly. He took a series of turns that he hoped would confuse his pursuers, following passages that led deeper into the system rather than toward obvious exits. If he could reach the chamber beneath the courthouse, there might be another way out, behind him. Prescott's voice echoed through the tunnels. You can't hide down here forever. Tom, these passages have been our family's domain for 4 generations. We know every inch of this system. Tom found himself in a section of the tunnels that felt different from the others. The construction was older, more primitive, with rough stone walls that looked like they'd been carved by hand rather than constructed with modern tools. He realized he'd found the original passages that had existed before the town's founders had expanded the system. At the end of this older section, Tom discovered something that made him stop despite the approaching danger. A narrow opening led into a natural cave system that extended beyond the man-made tunnels. Fresh air flowed through the opening, suggesting another exit somewhere in the system. But more importantly, the cave walls were covered with pictographs and symbols that were clearly much older than anything he'd seen in the constructed chambers. This was the original sacred site, the heart of whatever Native American settlement had existed here before Cedar Falls was built over it. Tom photographed as much as he could with his camera's flash, knowing this evidence might be his only chance to prove the truth. Then he heard Prescott's voice, much closer now. "I can see your light, Tom. There's nowhere left to run. Come out, and we can discuss this like civilized men." Tom switched off his flashlight and pressed deeper into the natural cave system, hoping it would lead to an exit that Prescott and Blackwood didn't know about. The natural caves proved to be Tom's salvation. After what felt like hours of careful navigation through narrow passages, he emerged through a concealed opening in the hillside behind the cemetery, nearly a mile from his house. Dawn was breaking as he made his way back through the woods, staying off the main roads until he was certain he wasn't being followed. Tom's first stop was the bank. If his father had left evidence in a safety deposit box, Tom needed to retrieve it before Prescott and his allies realized he'd escaped the tunnels. The key he'd found in his father's workshop felt heavy in his pocket as he approached First National Bank. The same building his father's blueprint showed was connected to the underground network. The bank manager, Robert Chen, was a nervous man in his 50s who clearly recognized Tom's name when he presented his identification and the safety deposit box key. "Mr. Mitchell, We weren't expecting you," Chen stammered, fidgeting with his tie. "Your father's box has been sealed pending a state resolution. There are certain complications." "What kind of complications?" "I have the key and the death certificate." Chen glanced around the lobby as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Perhaps we should discuss this in my office." Once behind closed doors, Chen's nervousness became more pronounced. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to be frank with you. There have been inquiries about your father's safety deposit box from several prominent families in town. They've suggested that some of the contents might be town property that your father was holding for safekeeping." Tom felt his anger rising. "Are you telling me that Prescott, Harrington, and Blackwood have been trying to access my father's private safety deposit box?" "I can't discuss other customers' inquiries, but I can tell you that the pressure to restrict access to your father's box has been significant." Chen paused, studying Tom's face. "However, legally, you have every right to access the contents as his heir. Then let's go see what my father left for me." The safety deposit box was larger than Tom had expected, and its contents made clear why the three families were so desperate to control it. Along with his father's will and insurance papers, Tom found multiple USB drives, a collection of photographs, and several audio recording devices. But it was the manila envelope marked, "For Tom, open only in emergency," that contained the most damaging evidence. Inside were copies of bank records showing payments to federal officials, correspondence proving the suppression of archaeological surveys, and detailed financial records of artifact sales dating back decades. The USB drives contained digital copies of everything Tom had seen in the underground chambers, plus additional evidence his father had gathered over years of careful documentation. Hidden camera footage showed the three families examining and cataloging stolen artifacts. Audio recordings captured conversations about bribing officials and eliminating potential witnesses. Most damning of all was a recorded phone conversation between Daniel Prescott and Margaret Blackwood discussing plans to deal with Harold Mitchell permanently after he'd threatened to expose their operation to federal authorities. Tom also found a sealed letter addressed to him personally. His father's handwriting was shaky, as if written under stress. "Tom, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. I've discovered something that goes far beyond what I initially thought was simple corruption. The three families that control this town have been systematically destroying one of the most significant Native American archaeological sites in the region. They've murdered to protect their secret, and they'll murder again. More importantly, you need to know the truth about your grandmother. Mary Crow Feather was a member of the Lakota tribe whose ancestral lands included this area. You carry the blood of the people whose sacred sites are being desecrated. This land is calling you home for a reason. I've documented everything, but I may not live to see justice done. The evidence in this box should be enough to expose the truth and return the stolen artifacts to their rightful people. Trust no one in town, except possibly Sarah Harrington. She seems to have a conscience unlike the rest of her family. Be careful, son. These people have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again. But someone needs to speak for the dead, both the ancestors whose graves have been robbed and the people like me who tried to do the right thing. Complete what I couldn't finish. Honor your grandmother's people. Dad, Tom sat in the bank's private viewing room, overwhelmed by the weight of what his father had left him. The evidence was comprehensive enough to destroy the three families and expose decades of criminal activity. But it also revealed a heritage Tom had never known he possessed. His grandmother had been Native American. The restlessness he'd felt his entire life, the sense that he never quite belonged anywhere, suddenly made sense. He wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting for his own people. Mr. Mitchell? Chen's voice interrupted his thoughts. Is everything all right? You've been in there for quite some time. Tom quickly secured the evidence in his jacket and prepared to leave. But as he emerged from the viewing room, he saw Daniel Prescott entering the bank lobby, flanked by two men Tom didn't recognize. Their eyes met across the lobby, and Prescott's expression shifted from surprise to cold calculation. Tom realized his window of safety was closing rapidly. Prescott now knew he'd accessed his father's evidence, and there would be no more pretense about accidents or natural deaths. The drive into Cedar Falls felt like traveling backward through time. Tom's pickup truck rumbled past farmland that stretched endlessly toward Purple Mountains, the same view that had filled his bedroom window as a child. 25 years of concrete dust and steel beams had nearly erased these memories, but now they flooded back with startling clarity. The town itself appeared frozen in amber. Main Street still boasted the same red brick buildings, their facades weathered but dignified. Henderson's General Store displayed hand-painted signs in its windows, and the old courthouse stood sentinel at the town square, its limestone steps worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Only the modern cars parked along the curbs betrayed the passage of decades. Tom pulled into the gravel driveway of 412 Maple Street and cut the engine. Silence settled around him like dust.